to the people who are attending, and I hope that it helps them, it helps to clarify ideas for them.
Okay.
Yes, I think because we have been like 8 minutes past the time, I think we might start now. And while we are waiting for more participants to join in, so maybe I would like to start with a bit of introduction. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for Dr. Cheryl in Fiji. So we would like to welcome you in this guest lecture session in the topic of inclusive education. So we are going to learn from Dr. Cheryl, and before we start the session, I would like to ask Dr. Endang from the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Airlangga, to give some opening remarks. Please, Bu Endang.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Pramesti. Good morning, everyone, participants from Indonesia. Good afternoon, Prof. and Cheryl Armstrong from Auckland University in New Zealand, but right now still in Fiji, in Fiji Island, And also, what is good day, for everyone who joined from many other places, This is such a very good opportunity for us from Faculty of Psychology in Airlangga University to have Dr. Cheryl Armstrong to share her knowledge and also experience in inclusive education, not only in Auckland or Pacific Islands, but I think also in other places in the world. So we hope, Dr. Ann, that this experience and this knowledge would also improve not only knowledge for us, but also possibility for expanding, the collaboration, much more collaboration, and also expanding the knowledge then to communities of population in Indonesia, to the government in Indonesia, in improving the quantity and also quality of inclusive education, with the role of Faculty of Psychology from Airlangga University, And we also really glad that students and also participants from some countries also involved in this guest lecture, so we can start collaboration, from now, And in such a difficult time with a pandemic, we hope that it is over and it's really over, it's not come back again, We still have time to share, and we have in healthy situation. We also hope that, as we discussed a little bit before, that this is the side effect of the pandemic, that we can connect, with others in very easy modes, like doing Zoom and online modes. So spreading knowledge is not really expensive anymore. So please get welcome please accept our welcome, on behalf of the faculty, the dean, and all the colleagues here in Faculty of Psychology. And we hope we can collaborate more in many other ways and in many other forms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Endang. And I would like to introduce Professor Cheryl to the participants. So Dr. Cheryl is a honorary professor at the University of Auckland School of Critical Studies in Education in Auckland, New Zealand, but she is based in Fiji because she is currently the regional project manager of the University of Auckland MF80 funded project in the building teaching capacity for inclusive education in 5 countries in the South Pacific. And Dr. Cheryl is an accomplished professional academic with an extensive international profile, and she is committed to inclusion, global higher education, and international partnerships. So please, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Cheryl.
Shall I start by saying Assalamualaikum and terima kasih. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you today. And as you rightly said, technology provides so many opportunities, because I did meet Pramesti for the first time. I met her online. I'd like to, at this time, acknowledge the Dean of the Faculty of Psychology, Professor Dr. Suryanto, and Dr. Endang Surjanin Grum. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, the Vice Dean for Research, Innovation, and Community Development, and also Dr. Nur Aini Fardana, the Vice Dean for Academic and Student Affairs. Last but not least, Dr. Pramestri Paramita, who is the moderator for this afternoon session, who was the connection, the person who reached out to me and said, can I invite you to do a session with us? And so I gracefully accepted. So for that, thank you very much. Can I tell you a little bit about myself? If you look at me, I could look like anybody in the world, but my country of birth is Trinidad and Tobago. So I actually come from the Caribbean. So I am from the last country in the chain of islands just before Venezuela. And from there, I worked in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean. I moved to the UK, did my PhD in the UK and worked in the UK and across Europe. Then I moved to Australia and worked at the University of Sydney in charge of professional learning and development for the Faculty of Education there. Then I went to Western Sydney, where I helped to re-engineer their university for summer school. And then I moved to the University of the South Pacific so I could understand more about the Pacific region. And from there, I'm at the University of Auckland, where, as Pramestri says, I'm working on 5 countries in this region. But I have been involved with inclusive education since 1985. So that's a very, very long time, and all sorts of capacities. I've developed policy and interventions. I've worked with schools. I've developed strategies, national strategies. So I've got a fair bit of experience. And being in the Pacific has given me another set of understandings about working in this region. I am going to share my screen now. Share. Just bear with me 1 minute. Right. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes.
Yes, very good. So,
but it is sorry, it is still in the like not the full screen mode.
okay, so I'll
yes.
do full screen for you.
Okay, thank you.
How's that?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, I'm going to be talking today, I'm going to be doing an introduction to inclusion and inclusive education. And if you look at my cover here, we see a tree and different branches and leaves, and the leaves have different colors. And humans are like a tree. The human race is like a tree. We all have branches, so we belong to different countries. We have all sorts of different people in our midst. We have all this background going on here, and we are in the business of education, and education is about growth. So this is important when we think about inclusion and inclusive education. The tree doesn't say, I don't want these leaves, I don't want those branches. It is humans who cut branches and who cut leaves from trees. And so that is an important aspect to think about. So, hello, Salamat Pagi. And it's really lovely to see you today. Again, we have flowers, and the flowers are all different, and the leaves are part of the flowers, and they are different. Today, we are going to be exploring the concept of inclusion. We are looking at equity and equality because those words are used as meaning the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing. When you talk about inclusion, you automatically have to think of exclusion. So we're going to have a look at exclusion. We're going to look at inclusion matters, a glimpse of history, some models and perspectives, and then we are going to talk about the importance of understanding the context in which we operate, the relevance of language, and then I'm going to share with you some examples from across the world. So what is inclusion really? What are we talking about? Whoops. Yeah, what are we talking about? When we talk about inclusion, what are we including people or children into? So we look at this is our little classroom here, or little university, our country, our community, this blue cup. And when we look at all the things in the blue cup, all the straws are different, but yet they're straws and they belong and they're useful. And so it's looking at the concept of how we fit together in society. So what is inclusion? I'd like to share a story with you. It's a true story. So this was a story that was told to students in Trinidad in the 1990s. And it was told by a Ghanaian lecturer. This lecturer was from Ghana, a country in Africa. He was very bright. He was a philosophy lecturer. And he said, my uncle, he was responsible for my upbringing and he was blind. So class, what do you think? Do you think he was disabled? Everyone had their new knowledge from all sorts of professional learning short courses. And they all said, yes, he was disabled. And they said it with confidence. This was, of course, based on the knowledge that they had. And he said, well, I will tell you that he wasn't. But they said, they challenged him. They said, but your uncle, he was legally blind. And he said, no, I tell you that he wasn't. So the class looked at him very shocked. And they asked him to explain further, because clearly there was something wrong with the lecturer's uncle that needed to be fixed. He was blind, and he explained, my uncle was not disabled because to me, he was my uncle. He was human first. That incident teaches us something very profound. As humans, we have to go and look at the heart of the subject. We have to begin by acknowledging the personhood of all persons, all people. We have to go beyond labels and recognize that under the skin, we are all the same. And there must be some level or some balance that where we can accommodate all people. And more importantly, when we say all, we don't have to qualify it by saying, well, all meaning the poor and all meaning disadvantaged, or all meaning the disabled. All means all. And I have a little piece of that story to share. That uncle was a professor at a university in Switzerland, even though he was blind. This was in the 1990s and before. And even though he was blind, he was teaching a class full of students. He had an idea of having a tablet in front of him, you know, like a smart board. And he had this idea where if I write something here, somebody must be able to translate it onto a big screen so that my students can communicate with me and understand what I'm trying to say. So this uncle contacted IBM, the producers in those days of word processors and of course microcomputers, and said, this is what I want you to build for me. And because he was so innovative and creative, they did it for him and he was able to work more efficiently with his students. But the idea is all sorts of people make up the world. And this particular uncle was responsible for giving care and upbringing to this particular lecturer, this Ghanaian lecturer of this professor of philosophy when he was a child. So he owes a lot of his success to his uncle. Listen to this.
Inclusion. Everybody's talking about inclusion right now, but what does it mean? Let's start with a little story. These are Max, Lynn, Ada, and John. They're sitting in the waiting room at their doctor's. Everyone has their own reason to be here. You see that every child needs a different medical treatment. But what if the doctor gave all the four the same medicine? Let's say cough medicine. It would only help John to get better, because the others have different needs for their illnesses, and would that be fair? Like these kids, the people in our society also have different needs. A society is composed of lots of people. People with different religions and mentalities, different sexes, skin colors, and different sexual orientations. We can see people with or without disabilities, old people, young people, fast people, slow people, tall people, and small people. All this is social diversity. But because every human is different, we often judge people by their individual features. These judgments lead to social exclusion, separation, and discrimination, and make us think that it is not normal to be different. So, why don't we think outside the box and make it normal to be different? This is the idea of inclusion, and it's quite simple, isn't it? If every person can participate in society, then inclusion succeeds. Since 2006, inclusion is considered a human right. By signing the UN Disability Rights Convention, every country agreed on creating conditions in every social sector, which includes the interests and needs of every person with a disability. But careful, a disability in this context doesn't only mean a physical handicap, but it is seen as a mental barrier which predominates in society's mind. So, what is inclusion? Inclusion means that diversity is so vital that every person's needs are respected, so that everyone has access to the same opportunities to live, play, and learn together. So you see, the demand for inclusion leads to a reflection on our basic principles of social living. Inclusion is only successful if every person understands that diversity enriches our lives. Differences are normal. Everybody's different. Everybody's human. Let's grow diversity. Let's cultivate inclusion.
Okay, so the message from that is that it's normal to be different. If we all look at each other, if you can see the other people who are participating in this lecture, you will see that we're all different. We have different skin colors, different ways of understanding the world. And so it's just normal. It's what society is made of. So what is inclusive education? It is a process. It is a process of strengthening the capacity of the education system to reach all learners. It should guide all education policies and practices, starting from the fact that education is a basic human right and the foundation for a just and equitable society. Inclusion is about building communities and citizenship and developing nationhood. So when you talk about inclusion, as you saw, everyone is individual and different. So here we talk about diversity. We should have equal access to opportunities, which is equality. And with inclusion comes a sense of belonging and feeling respected, feeling valued for who you are. And there should be a commitment from others to support you so that you can do the best that you can, so that you could be the best person that you could possibly be while you're here on the earth. So in terms of disabled people have voices, they can speak, whether they have to use sign language or braille, or whether they can use their voice or communication boards. Disabled people can speak, and many of them may have conditions that make them different from other disabled people and make them different from people who are not disabled. And the experience of disability can be created from circumstances. So let me give you an example. If people are poor and they live in very rural communities and they cannot afford particular medicines, or there is no proper or adequate health facilities where they are, then they can have cataracts and experience blindness. It is a circumstance of their life. If they don't have enough food to eat and they are therefore malnourished, then that is a circumstance of life. If they're living very far in rural communities, then they may not have the best teachers teaching them, and then they would be disadvantaged because of the circumstances of their life. So these are many things that we need to consider when we're talking about disability and disabled people. And also, if you have illnesses that don't allow you to access adequate schooling and adequate education, and you don't have access to resources, those things hold you back. So a child who is constantly sick from things like asthma or diabetes, or I don't know, keep getting the common cold or epilepsy, any of those things will hinder the learning of some of the students. So this can be a result of the way they are also treated by others. So if they walk differently or they speak differently and other people start to look at them and point their fingers and say, "Oh, you are different. We don't like you because you sound different and you look different and perhaps you smell different. We don't want to be associated with you." And sometimes, with regard to policy decisions, sometimes government policy don't include sufficiently opportunities for people who are disabled. So those are things that we need to consider. Inclusion is about reducing inequalities because every learner matters equally. So if we look at terms and then their opposites. So if you have inclusion, as I said before, there's the opposite of it. You have exclusion, you have equality, then you have inequality. You have equity, you have inequity. You have fairness, you have unfairness. You have justice, and you have injustice. And we will go through some of these so you can understand the differences in how we work with people. So we'll first look at equality and equity. They sort of look different, but they sort of look the same. And very often people use them to mean the same thing. But are they the same? They are not the same. Equality is not equity. But why is equity important? So if we look at this diagram, everybody is standing on a little crate, on a little box. Everybody wants to look at the match, the baseball match that's happening in the field. But these people here are not sitting in the stands where these other people are sitting. The tall person can see clearly. The young child, probably, preteen, young child, can barely see above the fence, but the little baby cannot see and is trying to look at a crack between the fence. That's equality because they're all standing on the same crate. Now, equity. Equity means that we are going to give you what you need to be able to access the same view. So the tall man is already tall. So if he stands up without a box, he can see. The child in the middle is already on a box and he can see. But the baby now has the box from the man. So baby can see now. That's equity. That's giving people what they need so they can participate. But the reality is, unfortunately, the man who already has, or the person who already has a perfect view wants more and takes all the boxes and is able to stand way above everybody else. He has the perfect view. The little child here can still see, but baby, poor baby doesn't stand a chance. His box has been taken away from him. Sadly, that is the world that we live in. So as educators, as people who are caring, humane citizens of the world, we have to try and ensure that more equity prevails. So I hope you understand through this diagram the difference between equality, equity, and reality. So equality equals sameness. Equality is about sameness. It promotes fairness and justice by giving everybody the same thing. So if we say equality, people say, yeah, we are for equality. But do you understand what we actually mean? It can only work if everyone starts from the same place. In the example, you will see that equality only works if everyone is the same height. So if everyone is the same height, that's here, it works. But it works if it's equity. Equity equals fairness. Equity is about fairness. It's about making sure people get access to the same opportunities. Sometimes our differences and our histories can create barriers to participation. So we must first ensure equity before we can enjoy equality. So here we see equity at play, but it's also equal in a fair manner because we can all access the same thing. So you see that equity and equality do not mean the same thing. It is a common misconception, and sometimes people use it interchangeably when they're talking about education. But the truth is, they do not and cannot. The two words are similar. So please, when you're talking about equality, make sure you're talking about equality and not equity. If you mean equity, say equity. Equality is not equity. Why is equity important? Distributing resources equally does not provide everyone with equal opportunity. So if you give the same $10 or 10 balls to the 10 children, but one child doesn't have arms, what is the point of giving the child without an arm the ball unless you give them a prosthetic arm? You have to share according to equity. Resources need to be allocated according to need. And too often, as we saw in the diagram, the children in the greatest need often really receive the least resources. What is the difference? So let's talk about this. Should student funding at every school be exactly the same? That's a question of equality. But should students who come from less get more in order to ensure that they catch up? That's a question of equity. So if you give the richest child the same amount of resources as the poorest child, then that does not allow the poorest child to catch up. It ensures that the rich child gets more, but does not even it out for the child who has less. So we need to make sure, that all children have equal access to resources. The truth remains that some students will always need to get more so that they can catch up. Equity is important because very often, as I explained to you, children from low-income backgrounds and children from remote locations require more resources. We need for them to close the achievement gap. We can close the equity gap by ensuring that those who come from low-income families have access to excellent teachers, that their schools have the funding to provide them with the high-quality education they need to succeed. And it is only when we use these strategies that we can narrow the gap. One of the important things about understanding about inclusive education is about quality education. It is about providing resources where they are needed. It is about understanding that at any point in any child's development, they could experience a special educational need. And I'll say that again. Any child at any point in their development can experience a special educational need. Now, this may be a non-disabled child, but the child, let's say the child was home because they had measles or chicken pox or something like that. They were away from school for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. They came back to school and nobody decided to provide that extra teaching that they would have needed to fill the gap for that period of time that they were away from school. Now, that child does not understand what is going on in the classroom because they missed class for 2 or 3 weeks. What do you think will happen in such a situation? Well, they would have a gap in their knowledge. Let's say it's long division. They would not know how to do long division. Next year, they go up to the next class. Nobody has filled in the gap. The teacher in the next class thinks, oh, this is a dunce child. Child doesn't know how to do long division. But that's because there's a gap in the child's knowledge. It doesn't mean that the child is disabled. It means that the child has a special educational need at the point when they had their measles and that need wasn't met. So it is important to make sure that we fill the learning gaps. So when we think about equity of access, all children should be given that opportunity to succeed. If teachers had recognized that the child was absent and took some extra time to teach the child, that gap would have been closed. And now we think about technology adding a new dimension. So because of technology, everybody now here is logging on through a computer. We have Wi-Fi. Do children in rural communities have access to any of these sorts of resources? Probably not. Do you have technology-driven software so that people who are blind can have voice-assisted translations? We have to think about these sorts of things when we are designing schools and homes and looking at how best we can support districts, etc. And we need to make sure that our teachers are adequately qualified. We need to make sure that qualified teachers are in buildings that are safe and also buildings that disabled students can get to, can access. So Jacob and Holsinger, they define equality as the state of being equal in terms of rank, quantity, status, value, or degree. And equity is about social justice. It is about fairness, justice, and impartiality when we think about distribution of resources at all levels. We talked at length about this, and we have to make sure that we respond to diversity and provide for successful inclusion of immigrants and minorities within mainstream education. We have to make sure that there are opportunities to support disadvantaged parents so they can help their children learn. Remember that parents are children's first teachers. And when we ignore parents, then we sort of ignore children as well. We also make sure that there's some sort of support provided for children at school so children don't have to repeat their schooling. So in terms of resourcing we have to provide strong education for all, giving priority to early childhood provision and basic schooling, making sure that we direct resources to students with the greatest needs, and set concrete targets for more equity, especially when we look at low school attainment and dropout rates. I mean, in society, we forget to talk about those who drop out of school. Children drop out of school when they are frustrated, when school makes no sense to them, when they feel as if they don't belong, where the teacher doesn't speak the same language. And I don't mean necessarily the language of transmission, but they are not on the same wavelength as the student. They are overly strict. They don't spend time explaining things to students, etc. Now, we talked about inclusion, and we said that the opposite of that is exclusion. So there you have all sorts of situations happening in the world about exclusion. When we think about inequality and inequity, that leads to exclusion. So when we think about poor health and nutrition, that's related to exclusion. Disability is related to exclusion. When we think about overage entry, so children who are way past the entry age for primary school, and they are only now coming to primary school when they're in their early teens or just in their preteens, like 10, 11, they're just arriving at primary school. Those are delayed progression to education. And it means that that is an exclusive sort of situation where you find bullying also takes place in such situations, because as humans, we teach our children to discriminate. We may not do it intentionally, but we look at how people are different. That person is too skinny. That person is too fat. That person is in a wheelchair. Oh, something must be wrong with them. That person has been coughing all the time. Oh, that person looks as if they're malnourished. Oh dear. And then that person only just coming to school, not good enough. And that is how we teach children generally. So in terms of exclusion, while it happens at early childhood and while it happens at primary school, it's a much greater problem at secondary school. And this is where we find that lots and lots of children fail within the system because they feel that they don't belong. Sometimes their parents are too poor to buy the secondary school books or to buy the uniform. And this happens in not necessarily poorer countries, but poorer sections of all sorts of countries. So poorer sections of even Australia, America, England. So it's not surprising that it also happens in developing countries. And so we have to be careful of how many children fall through the gap. Because if I say to you, children are falling through the gap, what do you think happens when they fall through the gap? Those are the children who end up doing misbehaving in society. And then we say, oh, look at them, they're badly behaved children. But we have not tried to include them. We have excluded them for so many years that they live on the fringes of society and they have become outcasts. So now they are rebellious, they are filled with hate, they are filled with resentment, and they feel that they didn't get their fair share, and they react in violent ways. So we have to think about how we engage and save our children. So what they're saying here, those who succeed ultimately will come from richer households, and the children from the poorest 20% have slim chances of completing secondary school. Children who never enroll remain the most excluded group in a large number of low enrollment countries, and their rights to education are completely compromised. Often, those who never attend are more likely to be children from poor households. It doesn't always work that way, but sometimes it does. If there are lots and lots of children in the household, in the family, sometimes in some communities, girls are not afforded an education. And of course, we know the most disadvantaged are the children with disabilities and of course, orphans. Children who have been given up for adoption or whose parents have died, even if relatives take them into their homes, sometimes they're taken into homes and they're made to do the chores of the house and not given an equal opportunity to education. Now, there is something called silent exclusion, and it is more widespread than we think it is. And they are attending less than 90% of time at school. They're usually overage, so they are 2 years older than the average age of the class, and they have repeated more than 1 year of schooling. It means that they're the children who are left behind. So they're in the back class, the back bench of the classroom, and year after year after year, nobody bothers with them. They have all been relegated to the bottom of the pile. Poor attendance of children and teachers. Sometimes some teachers just don't go to school. They find all sorts of excuses, while in many occasions, there are teachers who are committed to education and education to all children. There are some teachers who do not turn up for, there are some teachers who do not turn up to their classrooms. Of course, poor health and nutrition are related to late enrollment, and we spoke about that, and we spoke about dropouts, and we spoke about disability. Now, we have to be able to identify each student's level of performance. It is not enough to keep a student in a class. Excuse me. It is not enough to keep a student in a class and not identify their expertise and where their difficult areas are. Teachers need to understand and to gauge the effectiveness of their teaching so that they can teach each student so that they can learn as well as possible. And this is where assessment comes in. It should not only focus on the students' characteristics and whether they came first, second, or third in class, but it's also to look at the curriculum and how each student can learn within the curriculum. Is the curriculum varied in a manner that allows each student to learn? We talked about that. Right. Why children may experience exclusion. It can take many forms. So they are treated badly because of a disability, because of our own ignorance or prejudice about other people's social background, because they come from a remote communities. And when you have a country as big as Indonesia with different sections, districts, communities, you have cultures and subcultures, and you have the main language, and you have other languages that are used in these different communities. When they go to a school, if their parents move, they go to school and the children and the teachers laugh at them because their language is not the same and because their practices are different, without understanding that you have to socialize them and teach them about how things work in a larger community. And sometimes they have been ill, as we talked about before. Now, inclusion matters, and I want you to listen to this little video.
As children with disabilities, we know how we feel. That's why it is important for us to be heard. When I got polio, I lost my friends. My parents left me while they worked on the farm. I was alone. On my first day at school, I was not happy because I lived with a disability. I was unable to walk.
My older brother says go to school. If you become educated, other community members will realize that even though you have a disability, you can do something.
When I started school, the teachers called an assembly for all the pupils in the school and said, "This is a friend of yours. She's now one of the members of the school, so consider her one of your friends too. Don't be afraid of her. She's like you. Her condition is not a risk." So from then, they started playing with me. I started to become happy. I started having friends. I think it is important for children with disability, like the hearing impaired and vision impaired, to go to school. That is why they should have training for teachers.
I want to be a doctor. Once I am educated, I will return to my community and build clinics to treat people.
When I am a lawyer, I will encourage and support children with disabilities to get an education so they can look forward to their future. Whether or not we have a disability, we are all human beings. We all have the same human rights.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little video. So let's reflect on disability. There's a lifelong cost. It's not just about, oh, we should do better, but there's a lifelong cost with regard to supporting a disabled child. There's a cost to the family, a cost to the community, and of course, the state and the taxpayer. The way children are educated and their lifelong interactions with other members of society and social institutions have an impact on their self-perception and how they understand themselves, how they see themselves, and also how they see their opportunities. So we should also reflect on who makes decisions for children and adults with disabilities and how these decisions affect their lives. Inclusive spaces. You are here today listening to me talk about inclusion and inclusive education, but you need to think, what makes a classroom, a school, and an education system genuinely inclusive? We don't just wake up one morning and say, oh, let's do inclusion. It's about a set of decisions. It's a set of processes that we have to make. We have to think, what are the small things? What are the opportunities that we can provide for social engagement? How can we promote inclusion and devalue bullying? How can we value all children? So, if we think about education and special educational needs, we have to be concerned with the needs of all children. As I said earlier, that any child at any point in their development can experience a special educational need. And a special and educational need is not defined by a child's condition or a state of mind or behavior. It arises in the context of the relationship, of a relationship. So in this instance, it might be a relationship between the child and the teacher. It might be a relationship between the child and the children and the other children in the classroom. It might be as a relationship between the child and their parents or other members of the community. And schools, by the way they treat children, can create handicapping conditions. So you always put this particular child in the back of the class because you don't want to be bothered. Or you don't do a readiness check, a screening check with your children to see whether some of them can hear in both ears. Many years ago, I was teaching a class and this child was always shouting. And I would say, Zifra, why are you shouting like that? But she was a cheerful child and she's quite bright. And then we had people from the hospital come in to do ears, nose, and throat tests for all the children. And it was discovered that this child was deaf in one ear. So she was shouting because she couldn't hear in one ear. So those are things that happens in our classrooms, and we need to pay attention to that so that we, as members of learning communities, do not create handicapping conditions and as a result, special educational needs. Now we're going to do a quick run through history. So before Christ, because that's just the timeline that we use, to 500 AD, so it's the era of extermination. This is the era of survival. This is the era where disabled infants were killed. Disability was seen as a punishment of the gods. It was seen as an evil side. And philosophers like Plato and Aristotle from Greece, they called for infanticide. They said, we need to kill these little children, these babies. And they wanted the purity of the race. So they wanted a society that was free from people who were defective. They were training people to be soldiers to take care of the city. So they were looking for military superiority. Remember, people were always at war with each other. So that was long time ago. So what happened? Some of them were chained, some were left in hills to die, some were thrown off cliffs, some were locked away, some were drowned. It was the father's right to terminate the child's life. And children who were blind or deaf or ill had little or no chance of survival. They were born that way, they died. From 500 to 1600 AD, it was the era of superstition. So there we have the angels on one side and the demons on the other side. And it was thought that if you were disabled, you were possessed by an evil spirit. And I need to tell you that even though this was happening then, 500 to 1600 AD, and it sounds like a long time ago, people in some remote communities continue to believe that it is a curse, that God is punishing you because you have a child who is disabled. And this is when religion and mysticism started to appear, where that was a punishment for sins, and a demon invaded your body and you had sex with the devil. And it sounds weird, but it's how some people believed. And so they tried to give donations to the church. And when people became pregnant, they were giving offerings up to God and those sorts of things. Now, it brings me to the concept of Down syndrome. So Down syndrome, when I was a child, was called Mongoloid. The child was called Mongoloid because the child looked like somebody from the Mongol Empire. but it's actually called Down syndrome, known as trisomy 21. When I was a child, people would point fingers and they would probably laugh at somebody who had Down syndrome. Down syndrome is still trisomy 21, but that tells you for over a span of time, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, we are now seeing Down syndrome children can be educated. Down syndrome children can grow up, fall in love, get married, have children. The children need not have Down syndrome. They can be self-sufficient. They can work. Some children even go to university if there is enough stimulation, etc. And in Niue, one of the very, very tiny countries in the Pacific, a child who has Down syndrome has just graduated from secondary school. So little by little, we are beginning to see ability rather than disability. Remember, trisomy 21 hasn't changed. It is our attitude to the situation that has changed. In the Middle Ages, so 1100s to 1400s, this was the era of ridicule. So those with disabilities were used as servants or fools. And when I say fools, like the clown jester, so the court jester. So they were there so that the kings and those who were powerful could laugh at them. They would do silly antics, or they would serve people food, or they would wash the dishes, or wash clothes, or those sorts of things. Some were still put to death. Dwarfs, so people with dwarfism were used as clowns. And because they looked and behaved differently, these were seen as deformity. So they were seen as less than. Between the 1600s and the 1900s, it was a scientific era. So the natural events, lawful explanations replaced superstitious explanations, and human disturbances attributed to the lunar cycle. So it is said that at the full moon, people who have mental illnesses, that is the time when they act up. So if we think about lunar cycles of the ocean, when you get high tides and low tides, it is said that the lunar cycle also affects those with mental illnesses. And here you had the medical profession becoming dominant. And they were looking at things as biological dysfunction. So they were looking at things that were hereditary, where there were chemical imbalance, where there were glandular dysfunction, where there was disease and brain damage. And that spelled the emergence of the medical model that we will talk about in a little while. And some of these situations are used even today to explain a handicapping condition. So if we look here, I think this is in the wrong place, but still, if we look here, these are the major legislation that impacted the international support for special and inclusive education. Now, this one is really important. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This came about after the Second World War. After the First World War, then we had the Second World War. Lots of mostly men, some women, came back with missing limbs. Many of them came back with post-traumatic stress disorder because they saw death live and direct. They saw their friends being killed. They lost limbs, they lost arms, they lost legs. Sometimes they lost some of their vertebrae, etc., in their spine. And there were so many people who were broken as a result of the wars that these human rights were very important. They were developed to make sure that people had access to services, to resources, to mental, to health, to education, and those sorts of things, that they had access to food and clean water and all of those as a result. And that is the beginning of special and inclusive education as we know it. And then came the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, again, the right to education. And here we have coming down Convention Against Discrimination and the International Covenant, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So coming up to now, to 2015, we have the Sustainable Development Goals that everybody's familiar with, especially goal number 4, which speaks specifically to education. In the 21st century, we have Salamanca Statement, 1984, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. We had the Education for All at Jomtien, where they signed the treaty. Then we had the Millennium Development Goals of 2000. And as I said today, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. In 1990, the EFA set out a vision for universalizing access to and participating in education for all children, youth, and adults, and promoting equity. And we talked at length about equity. And it means about being proactive in identifying barriers that many children encounter when trying to access educational opportunities, and identifying the resources needed to overcome those barriers. Now, this is really important. It's in 1994, but this was the first time that the concept of inclusion was used in the literature. And this was at a place called Salamanca in Spain. And this is where they recognized that each child had unique characteristics, etc., and education system should be designed to accommodate a wide variety of characteristics and needs, and that those with special needs must be able to access regular schools, and it should be child-centered pedagogy. And they said this was one way of combating discriminatory attitudes and creating welcoming communities. And it was about building inclusive societies. And this is what it said. It said, besides disabled people, so all those, and this is really important, all those who are experiencing difficulty on a temporary or permanent basis. So those who've been repeating school for many years, we talked about those. There are children who live on the streets, street children who are forced to be sex workers, children who are forced to work just in plantations and never get to go to school. Nothing is wrong with growing up in a family where members of the family are farmers, but children must also have access to education. Children who live far from any school, children who are extremely poor, who are victims of war, who suffer abuses, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, anybody who suffers abuse. Or sometimes children are just out of school for whatever reason, because their parents hide them, because their parents are poor and don't have money to send them to school. So those are the things we need to consider. And in terms of education for all, you see here again, the poor and the disadvantaged, including working children. Children who belong to ethnic and linguistic minorities. And we talked about those with regard to Indonesia, but also in places like Vanuatu, in places like places like New Zealand, where they have Maori language and they speak English language. They're all linguistically identified as minorities, but their language is just as appropriate as the main language of expression. Children and adults who suffer from poor health, hunger, HIV and AIDS, and those with disabilities or special needs. Now, after that, we had the Millennium Development Goals. And the idea, they wanted to eradicate poverty, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality, etc. But it wasn't very successful intervention. And so they went from that to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is rooted in the right to education. So it goes straight back to Article 26 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we just talked about after the Second World War. And the goals were designed to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. You know, we talk about those as very lofty ideals, high-sounding ideals. But the interesting thing about it is, whose responsibility is it? Well, I would argue that it is our responsibility in our own corner of the world. So wherever we are in our world, in our community, we try to end poverty within our little communities. We try to protect our patch of the planet. And we try to ensure that there's some sort of equitable distribution so young people can access education. And that is how we make the planet sustainable. So the new understandings, it's rural people, indigenous people, and there are many indigenous people in Indonesia, people with disabilities, child workers, street children. Roma children are the children who live in Europe, and they live in nomadic societies. So they don't belong to a community, but they are called travelers because they travel from country to country, from camping site to camping site. And so they are roamers, they roam around. Now, this came about 23 years after Salamanca. Salamanca was 1994. It took them 23 years to get to this point. Just having a little drink of water here. The 20th century is a service era. So children were afforded a more humane lifestyle. They were protected by law. There was a lot of activism where people, where there was a focus on disabled people and their organizations. And we talked about the medicalization of disabled people and illnesses, etc. In the 20th century, we saw non-medical theory, so the social model being developed. And originally, they were developed by activists in the UK who were disabled, and they were saying, yes, we don't have legs, but we should be able to access the museum. We should be able to access the schools. What is society, what is the government doing to allow us to access? So that was called the social model, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So at one point, people with disabilities, and in some countries this still happens, they were placed in hospitals, in asylums, and in other institutions, and provided with very little education. Now, because there were different terms that were being used by various agencies, the World Health Organization developed these three definitions. So impairment refers to a physical or mental loss or abnormality at the level of a body organ. Yeah, so it's physically impaired. Disability refers to a person-level limitation in physical and psychocognitive activities of a person within the range considered to be normal. So this is again comparing somebody against some focus of normality, whatever that is. And then there's handicap, refers to the social abilities or relationships between the individual and society. So we talked about schools sometimes preventing children from learning. So it is a handicapping condition. Okay? It is something that is worth exploring a bit more. So let us look quickly at models and perspectives. We saw when the medical model was first creeping into society, and the medical model gave rise to the idea that people or objects needed to be more normal. So if you were in a wheelchair, we need to fix you. If you had let's say you weren't able to see, we have to fix you and we need to get you to fit into society. which is an interesting way of looking at situations. And that is why we say society and classrooms create handicapping conditions, and they worsen things for students because they create special educational needs. Now, yes, a person may have a medical situation, but it is not the only thing that defines a person. A person is a person first. So in comes a social model of disability, and it was developed by somebody called Colin Barnes, who's a disabled activist and academic in the UK. And the model was a direct result of the lived experiences of people who were at that time living with impairment. People who were disabled were advocating for independence, self-determination, and active participation in the activities that were going on around them. So they wanted to go to schools, they wanted to go to the park, they wanted to go to the cinema, they wanted to go to church, and they wanted to take part in things that were just hanging around. And they wanted to do that by themselves and not necessarily with the aid of anybody else. So this is a social and political reinterpretation of disability. And then this is looking at society's actions, society's values and beliefs, and looking at ways in which society marginalized minority groups. So the model recognizes, this social model recognizes that society has a responsibility to modify and adapt its structures to accommodate children, but also adults with special educational needs, without having to lift them and their wheelchair up to so they can access services. This is a way where they can go to the hospital, they can get to the ramps, they can access videos and film and other things that everybody else has the ability to access. Now, there's also the psychomedical model, which is just another version of the medical model. And the model is recognized as the poor people, they live a tragic life, they are less than, so there's a deficit. And the child, therefore, has to change, adapt to be accommodated within society. And society doesn't have to change or provide access. It is just how things are. It's a tragic situation, but too bad. It's just another way of looking at the medical model. The disability movement decided that they wanted to have a voice, and they wanted to assert their human right through the legal system and through the employment of politics. And we're not necessarily talking about government politics, but we're talking about understanding how society works. And so there was the emergence of the biopsychosocial model. And this model suggests that biology is part of it. Yes, they may not have arms or legs, or they may have poor eyesight or no eyesight, and they may be deaf or hearing impaired. So that's the biology. But there's a psychological dimension about how they feel about themselves. And there's a social factor about how they are supported within the society. And this is a way of bringing different aspects of the human functioning into one particular concept. So it is important to remember that these are just models that have been developed over time, and that as time changes, people change and perspectives evolve, and people re-evaluate their positions in the world. So we progress and we re-evaluate our thinking. UNESCO has gone to this rights-based approach, and that is the perspective from where they start, that nobody should be excluded, that education is a public good, and that the focus should be on vulnerable and marginalized groups. They also talk about we should be accepted simply because of our humanity. Schooling should be free and it should be an obligation. There should be access, process, and results, regardless of age or ethnicity or geography, etc. And there should be full participation. Alas, we are in 2022, and we still see the majority of people with impairments facing a range of economic, political, and cultural barriers to mainstream living. Equitable access to education and educational opportunity is still a challenge, and these barriers continue to hold back progress. As I say, we don't start and say, oh, this is so much to do. We start with the little things. What are the little successes that we can achieve in our own space, in our own part of the world, and then we build from there. So we need to understand context. You don't take a model from England or America or Australia or New Zealand and you say, I'm going to implement it in Indonesia. It has to be culturally relevant. It has to be useful and meaningful within the context of where you are. All humans are nurtured within a context and a culture, and that's the starting point of learning. So you need to remember that people do not all see or even experience the world in the same way, whether they're not disabled or disabled. They all see the world differently. And as we saw from the history and from the different models that are presented, that people bring multiple perspectives to any learning situations, sometimes as a result of their gender, because of their age, their class, their disability, and so on. Learners, as we know, have their own history and cultures. And so the voice of the learner must be situated within the historical and cultural context, because those are the things that mold their experiences. It should be a starting point for social transformation, understanding that history and culture. And that is a starting point of transforming society. So Article 1, in terms of cultural diversity, culture takes diverse forms across time and space. Diversity is embodied in the uniqueness and plurality of the groups and societies making up humankind. And cultural diversity is necessary for humankind. It is as important as biodiversity is for nature. We talk about sustainability, but sustainability is not just about nature, but also about culture. And we need to understand that. We need to understand how to exchange, how to create, how to innovate. So creating an inclusive education system, what do we do about it? Well, we reflect and examine our values, our processes, our practices, our cultures. And then, as I said, we take the first step and begin to make small changes in the way we do things. The role of the educator is not to accept the stories of the students without question, but to enable students to reflect on their various situations and be able to critique their own experiences. So Len Barton was one of my professors at my University of Sheffield in the UK. And Len Barton was a major player in the disability movement and in inclusive education. He said, inclusive education is not an end in itself, but a means to an end, that of the realization of an inclusive society. It means that we don't just wake up one morning and become inclusive. We are always thinking about it and refining our thinking. It's a process. It's a way of how do we little by little move towards that understanding and realization of an inclusive society. Thus, those who claim to a commitment to inclusive education are always implicated in challenging discriminatory, exclusionary barriers and contributing to the struggles of an inclusive society. I want to share another story with you. One of my Indonesian students, her name is Nur. Many years ago, when I was teaching I was working at the University of Sydney in Australia. She shared some thoughts, and she got this idea from a Singaporean publication entitled Suzuki versus Porsche. She said, "We are all gifted because we are all individuals. Some of us open our gifts earlier than others. Some of us are very quick-minded, speedy, and flashy. And we can perceive ourselves as sports car like the Porsche or the Maserati or the Aston Martin. Then there are some of us who are not so quick, and we may have dents and bruises and may not have a sleek aerodynamic exterior and may be likened to little vans and pickups, not so fast and far less flashy. But when we negotiate through the crowded streets of the town or the city center, we are all navigating an even playing field because there's a certain ethic that applies to all vehicles regardless of their brand. Neither the sports car, nor the van, nor pickup is given a special advantage to weave through the traffic. At that point, they have an equal chance of making it to their destination. And that's the significant point. Each vehicle is going to their destination. In the final analysis, does it really matter who gets there first? The important thing is that we all arrive at our chosen destination confidently and honorably. Throughout the learning process, all students, regardless of their ability, their skin color, their cultural heritage, their gender, their social class, the size of their parents' wallets, should be able to negotiate a pathway in life and identify opportunities at the same time and also become aware of risks. They should learn how and when to use the various tools within their vehicles so they could become more effectively and efficiently move forward, apply the brakes, change the gear, turn in a different direction, and so on. Our students should learn that sometimes on the way to their destination, they may have to move faster, they may have to slow down, they may have to pull aside to rest, they may have to learn to turn left or turn right, or even make a U-turn. So we have to think about these sorts of things, and this story that was shared to me many years ago. So in this, it's an idealist perspective, this concept of inclusion, but it's a struggle for change. It's a struggle for justice and fairness. It's a struggle for the value and valuing of human life. And we have to contest education policy and practices in different contexts. And that is where hope for education lies. So inclusive education is concerned with minimizing and removing barriers, as we talked about. And it is especially for those who've been socially discriminated against. In terms of language, the relevance of language. We use language that is less than, that is derogatory, that's debilitating. The rule of thumb is when you talk about somebody with a disability, it's the person first, a person with Down syndrome, a person with epilepsy, not a Down syndrome person or a Down syndrome sufferer, not a deaf woman, a woman who is deaf, not deaf and dumb, which is a common thing that people use. It's deaf. So it's about understanding the importance of language. Avoid expressions such as mental retardation and victim of blindness and disabled children, etc. She uses a wheelchair. She has a physical disability, people with intellectual disability. So it's about the person first and not the disability first. Begin to change attitudes by changing our language. So we don't use these dumb, clumsy, retarded, moron, etc. So my question is, who are the people in our schools, in our villages, in our community? How can we bring them together so that we begin to form and develop a more inclusive society? Everybody wants what's best for their children. Anybody at any point in their life can experience a special educational need. It's normal to be different. And the majority of children who experience learning difficulties are not in special schools. They're already in the classroom. They have gaps in their knowledge. And remember, schools can sometimes be disabling spaces. So some people have failed several times before they get it right. Everybody knows about Oprah Winfrey, Steven Spielberg, who is the film director, Walt Disney, who made all those movies, Thomas Edison with the light bulb. Several times they failed, but they became somebody who made a difference in the lives of others. Now, this is a really important consideration. Everybody is just an accident away from a disability. You slip on a banana peel, and that's it. You may end up cracking some of the vertebrae in your spine. I'm not wishing that on you, but it is a possibility that people forget. You get in an accident, these things happen. Our world is diverse and complex, and every life, including disabled lives, do matter. Disabled people say nothing about us without us. So they have a voice. Include them in your conversations and try to eliminate stigmas as much as possible. So quickly, I'm going through this because we started a bit late, so I'm going to take a little 5 minutes to go quickly across the world just so that you see some successful disabled people. This man here is Eliesa Delana. He is from Fiji. He's a member of parliament. He lost his leg in a bus accident at 3. He was 3 years old. At 28, he won gold at the London Paralympics. This man here, see, he has hearing aid. He was Dr. Eric Williams. He was the first prime minister of the country I came from, Trinidad and Tobago. He was a historian, the author of several books, about 12 books. He was an economist, and he ruled the country for 32 years. He was an absolute brilliant person, well-renowned scholar. Here we have Baroness Gray Thompson. She's a former wheelchair racer. She had spina bifida. She is not just a wheelchair racer. She was a parliamentarian and a television presenter. Helen Keller was American. She was the first deafblind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree, and she dedicated her life to improving the conditions of blind and deafblind people around the world, lecturing in more than 25 countries. Stevie Wonder, he's a singer, musician and songwriter, record producer, etc. He is American. David Blunkett, he was a politician. He was the Minister for Education and Employment, Home Secretary and Works and Pension Secretary, and worked at, he was working at the University of Sheffield, where I studied my degrees. Stephen Hawking, everybody knows about Stephen Hawking. He was an English theoretical physicist. He was described as one of the brightest people on the planet. His health deteriorated to the point that it paralyzed him over the decades, and he was later able to communicate using a single cheek muscle attached to a speech generating device. Now, think of how far science has moved to be able to do that, so that he was able to communicate with others. This gentleman, Peter Hayden Dinklage, American actor, won several awards. And he has the condition of dwarfism. And he has advocated against typecasting, which means that his argument is, doesn't matter if I have dwarfism, I want to play proper roles, I want to explore my artistic talent, and I want to be not seen for my dwarfism, but seen as an actor. And he has succeeded in many events. Stella Young. Stella was a disability activist. She was a writer, comedian. She was a television personality. She passed away now, but she was absolutely brilliant. Well-known figure in Australia. And she says, I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you know, what you think you know about it, does. So reflect on it. What should a teacher look like? Stella always said. You could be a person in a wheelchair. That's a teacher. You could be a journalist. That's fine. Madeline Stewart, you can see her in the middle here. She's a fashion model. She has Down syndrome. So you see how far Down syndrome has come. And these are my friends. This is Vicky. Vicky is blind. She used to teach at Buxton College in the UK, but she's now living in Spain with her husband, Max. We did our PhD together, so she's Dr. Vicky. This is Claire. Claire has cerebral palsy. Claire went on to do an expedition in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific in 1986. At that time, I did not even know that there was a country called the Solomon Islands, and I did not know Claire at that point in time. But Claire did her PhD. She's Dr. Claire Tregaskis. She's brilliant. She has a wicked sense of humor. This guy here, Ron McCallum, he got the Order of Australia, which is one of the highest orders in Australia. He's an Australian legal academic, and he's an expert in labor law. He was a professor and the Dean of Law at the University of Sydney, totally blind, and he was appointed to a full professorship in both Australia and New Zealand, first ever in either Australia or New Zealand. And now he chairs the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So it shows you that we are differently abled. And this is something that I want to leave you with. Education policy is grown in the developed world. So in spaces in Europe, spaces in America, spaces in Australia, and they are exported to developing countries. But what you have to remember is that when you're developing systems, they must be developed within the culture and the context of your country so that it's relevant. Inclusion is both a principle and a process, and they need to be friendly, safe, clean, and healthy, and responsive to girls and boys. And here, there will be a link to this so you can access this article. And it's important to change the mindsets of the teachers before we change the school, because the biggest disability is your attitude. And we need to remember that. Inclusion involves valuing all staff and students, reducing barriers, thinking about cultures, policies, and practice in schools, thinking of ways of overcoming barriers, acknowledging the rights of students, fostering mutually sustainable relationships. And what do learners get out of the experiences at school? Well, they should gain self-esteem. They should increase independence, develop knowledge, make choices, express preferences, be active participants in the society. and gain communicative skills. So as teachers and mentors and tertiary educators, we should work towards being culturally competent and ensuring culturally safe learning environments for all. Help and develop and promote culturally inclusive, relevant, and appropriate curricula and pedagogies. Pedagogies are so important. Help reduce failures by better contextualizing learning and assessment tasks. Encourage students to study and research their own cultures, their own languages and knowledge systems, and contribute to their country development and sustainability. And help to reflect on education, reduce dependence on foreign intellectual sources by valuing works by local researchers and authors. I'll leave you with this final thought. People are differently abled. Labels are for jars, not for people. And as the young people say, don't diss my ability. And inclusive, thank you. Terima kasih. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Terima kasih, Dr. Anne Cheryl. That was really a comprehensive overview about inclusive education and the things that we should think about when we are talking about inclusion. And I will just provide a very short review. So Dr. Anne Cheryl has reminded us that we have to go beyond label and look at the person, that everybody is different, everybody is human. And when we are talking about inclusion, it is normal to be different. And again, people are differently able. So the biggest disability is our attitude, and how, in terms of how we should move forward, it is important to start with a little thing and build from there. And in this process, we should understand our own context and culture in our country. So thank you, Dr. Anne Cheryl. We are going to move on to the Q&A session. And if there is any participant who would like to ask questions directly, please raise your hand in the Zoom. Yeah, you can raise hand. And while we are waiting for participants who would like to ask your questions directly, we are going to read some of the questions in the chat box. And I think there are two people asking in the chat. For the first one, there are several questions from Sasat Ali. And so he is asking about if we are going to develop inclusive education, is it enough to focus on the equity and equality of the systems? And do we need to explore about the social system underlying our community, and how we can relate the discussion about equality, equity, and also the reality factors in the community with harassment and bullying for disabled people?
That's an excellent question. Now, what we have to understand is that we don't fix a community overnight. Communities are flawed. The point that I was making is that inclusive education was designed by the United Nations. The concept was developed in 1994, and lots of countries bought into this because there were activists who were saying that we need to provide support for everyone. Some countries some communities more than others are riddled with challenges. But that's why I said, little by little, we can develop a pilot and we can begin to show others through inclusive practices how we can make systems work. It is not our job to fix a whole community. We wake up tomorrow morning and we say, let's fix the community. It's a bad community. We're going to do it over. It doesn't work like that. We have to work on people's attitudes. We have to work on the social system, the class system. And even through simple things like if there's a sports club, there was a group of Indonesian students who came to the unit that I was managing at the University of Sydney. And one of the young men who was there, he was telling me about the sports club that he developed for the youth because they were getting into trouble. And he decided that sporting activities was one way of encouraging them. And that helped to turn the community around. Because one, it was physical exercise. Movement helps right brain, left brain. They become more interested in educational endeavors. You start at the point where they are and teach them little by little. You build their self-concept and help them to understand the world a bit better than they understand the world as it stands for them. And so when you get that, and then you do maybe social media coverage or media, the newspaper coverage about the little successes that are taking place in society, people start to pay attention. And then people start to think, oh, it's possible. Because this happens everywhere in the world. Parents are the biggest advocate for children. A lot of the disabled movements in the world started as a result of parents advocating for the rights of their child. Parents say, I want my child to have some skill. I want my child to be able to do particular things. Now, I am working in Fiji. Fiji is classed as a developing country. I'm physically located here. And because I'm physically located here, I've been asked to do some work with the Fiji Museum so that disabled people can access the museum. The people who I have invited to sit on the committee that I chair are disabled people. Because if we are designing something for them, then it is important that their voices are heard. So it's about how can we, in our little spaces, find ways to make things work. Little tiny incremental steps, little by little, it works.
Yeah, thank you. And so it is very important to involve those people with disability and maybe their families, their advocates within the process. And we can always try to do little things to find ways to make things work. And then we can, like, as you said before, try to get some social media coverage, for example, about the little successes. So we hope that we can,
The other thing that you can do is to access funds from international funding bodies, so that will help to fund some of the projects that you are thinking about.
Yep. Yes. And currently, I think there are like funds not only from the Indonesian government, but also maybe from international bodies, that we can explore in our community. And how about the question in terms of the bullying, maybe for those parts of the community with disabilities and things like that? Like, do you think these the things that we can do in terms within our community, the little things that we can do within our community can also help us with the problems in the bullying and those other kind of things?
Now remember that behavior is symptomatic of something that's not happening right in the hearts and minds of people. And the biggest disability is our attitude. So if we start an anti-bullying campaign and we show, whether it's on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, Twitter, we have little clips on how you react in a bullying situation, how to promote anti-bullying, have little posters around, get the government on side, so that you have to develop a situation where people buy into and understand that we are all in this together and we are not supportive of bullying. There are several strategies that you can use in terms of bullying. It's about understanding the root cause of the bullying and trying to level the playing field. And I can probably send you some information on that later.
Yes, thank you. So from your explanation, I guess we are not only discussing bullying in terms of people with disabilities, but for our parts of the community. And again, it is like being more inclusive here to include everyone in the community.
As far as possible.
Yes.
There will always be people who resist. You don't spend your time fussing about that. You spend your time working with people who understand what you're trying to achieve. And little by little, it works. It does work, but you have to be consistent, and you have to celebrate the little successes that you achieve along the way, because when you celebrate it, it's little by little, it mounts up, and then you realize how many things you have achieved and how successful you've been along the way.
Yes, thank you. And there is another question in the chat. So it is from Beatrix from East Nusa Tenggara. So it is an area in East Indonesia. So she said that, thank you for your inspiring lecture. It reminds us what we have done for this issue. It is still a big homework for us in East Nusa Tenggara, because we only have 5 special schools, and few of the school does the inclusive class or inclusive program. And the worst part is the people still consider that disabilities are condition of parents' sins or curse, and the religion and cultural strong issues still happen nowadays. And some parents still hide their children with disability. And she is asking what she can do as a lecturer in East Nusa Tenggara and as a part of the local community in the village. Would you mind to share your best practice so we can learn from it? Thank you.
Okay, that's an excellent question. And I have to tell you that when I've just completed inquiry in 5 different countries across the Pacific, and every one of them still have those issues where parents hide their children. They think it's a curse. And it's just endemic. It's woven deep into the fabric of the community. But one of the things you can do is to have a little workshop with food. And the workshop in your language would be parents as partners in education. So you are acknowledging that the parents are an important part of the community, of the school. And then you get little simple posters, or even a PowerPoint if you do have a PowerPoint, but simple ones where you are not talking down to the parent, but you're meeting them at the same level. And you must have food, must. And you explain to them what are the important things for children. You give them examples of successes, people who have been successful, who had disabled and have been successful. And if we believe, this is probably a religious thing now, if we believe that we were created by a creator, doesn't matter what religion, but we were created, then the spirit of the creator resides in all of us. It means that in order to honor the spirit of the creator, we have to be honoring the children. And it is quite possible that we have been given those children. So we learn the lessons of patience. We learn the lessons of tolerance. We learn the lessons of love. So if we have Down syndrome children have been known to be very friendly, free with expressions of love. Well, maybe we've been so rigid in our expression that we don't even realize that this child, Abdul, is probably the most loving child of all the children. And the child who cannot speak but is in a wheelchair, you see the child's eyes light up when there's a balloon. So we get to communicate with the child and understand their ways of happiness. We get to be tolerant to the child, because one day we will become old and probably dependent, and this child is teaching us what it is to have patience for those taking care of us. So there are different ways of addressing it, but it's about bringing them on board and about welcoming them into that part of the community.
Yeah, thank you. I can see Miss Beatrix in the room. Yeah.
I can see
Do
her
you yeah, do you want to ask?
Yes,
Yeah. Do you want to ask more question maybe, or is that enough?
That's enough, Brahms. My English is not really good, so
I hope you understood what I said. I hope it was not too fast.
no, yeah, I understand the one. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. And I think those are the two main questions from the chat box. And before we end the session, I want to ask whether there is one more participant maybe want to ask question maybe directly.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Maybe just a short question.
Yeah, it will just. Thank you so much, Dr. Anna. I really impressed with your answers, because I was looking something, such kind of guidance related to those things. Because when I saw the inclusive about this lecture, and I had some multiple questions in my mind, so I have asked them. And thank you so much for your answer. And it really makes me very comfort with your answers. So my other question is that it is related with that the other question that Dr. Petra asked, Mrs. Petra asked. So if the students, the parents still hiding their disabled students, stable kids, and they don't want to let the society know about their disability. So I got an idea while you were answering to the Petra. Sorry if I am pronouncing it wrong name. So I got an idea that if Ms. Petra can make a small community to share the knowledge to the people, or can arrange an event for disabled people, like a sport event, small event at a small place, like in a park, ground, or in the institutional premises. So it will work or not? That it will boost the motivation among the disabled students and their parents. It will be work or not? Thank you.
I think that's an excellent idea. You can have a family day, and you can have it at the park, and you can say all are welcome. We'll have games. It doesn't matter what disability the child has, but everybody is welcome. And that's how you build community spirit. And sometimes you go door knocking. So if you know that this child is in a family, you go with a little poster. It might be something with a drawing, but something that they can understand with their language. And you knock on the door and you say, hello, my name is, I am a teacher or a lecturer, I'm a whatever. I'm organizing a family day in the park on so-and-so day. We want all the children to come. And I understand that you have a child who cannot walk, or I understand you have a child with Down syndrome. We'd be very happy for that child to come and play with other children. We're trying new strategies to make things work in the community, and invite them. And even if they don't come the first time, you keep going and they will eventually come, because other people will come, and then you put it on, well, I don't know, TikTok, wherever, pictures from little video reels from the event showing children having a good time and parents having a good time. And you could even interview a few of the kids who are disabled. So yeah, I'll tell you a little story before we, close down. Up to 2 years ago, I had a student. His name is Fuata Factafon. He is from Rotuma, which is one of the islands of the main island of Fiji, and he's blind. Fuata was my brightest student. I'm talking about, I had like 200 students in my class, and Fuata got A+ for every course coming and going every semester. So a disability shouldn't define who you are. You should have the opportunity to be the best that you can be, whatever it is. I had another student. He is from Lambasa, which is the north of where I am. And he is a bit hearing impaired. He also has slow cognitive processing, but he is as bright as a button. So it'll take him a little while for the message to register. But when he answers, it's an excellent answer, and it's a thoughtful answer. He just graduated from university, and Fuata is the disability, I think it's the disability coordinator, disability officer at the Fiji National University. So there are so many successes, and that's another thing that you all could do. Identify who are the successes within your country, within your community, and you do little posters on them, little exposés, and you put it on, you develop a Facebook site, a community, and you put it on, and you get little exposés. You do interviews with them and little stories about them and their successes and things like that, and you normalize who they are. So Fuata is married, so is the other young man that I spoke about. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that you can do and use in the same way you are using social media to engage with me, is the same way that you use social media to engage with the community that you have around. Oh, the other young man is called Vimlesh Naidu. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anne Cheryl. And lastly, we want to have a photo session in the Zoom room. So everyone, if you want to put your camera on, please. Yes, that's great. So we can see your faces. Okay, so I will start taking the photos. Oh, wait, still some people still. Okay. Okay, so wait. Yeah. Okay. I will. There are 3 slides, so I will just smile and I will take the photo of you. Yes, and please wait. I'm going to the second and the third slide. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I've got your photos. Thank you, Dr. Anne Cheryl, and thank you everyone for joining in our session this morning. It has been really useful, I think, for all of us. And Dr. Anne Cheryl has provided a really comprehensive review of inclusive education and also some strategies here to be applied within our own community, wherever you are, because some of our students are currently being in their own areas because we are still combining the offline and the online or learning. So some of our students are still in their own communities. For example, like Beatrix is in East Nusa Tenggara. So thank you again for sharing, Professor Anne Cheryl. And I think we can end the session. So I hope all of you have a really good day. And thank you again, Dr. Anne Cheryl.
Bye, everybody.
Terima
Have a good
kasih.
day. Bye.
Yes.
Terima kasih.